Hey, welcome. Today we're talking about the ignition system, and today we're going to be focused on a very broad overview of the ignition system. Because the ignition system can be very complicated, it has a lot of components, it's got a lot of different functions, it can operate in a lot of different manners. So today is just a broad overview, and then in following classes we're going to break it down by different types of ignition systems as well as the different components that go into them. So with an ignition system, the first question that comes to mind is, what does it do? Why is it on our car? And just like it sounds, its job is to ignite. Its job is to ignite the mixture that's inside of the cylinder. And that mixture is usually some sort of mixture of fuel and air inside of our cylinder. We're going to get to what exactly this is in just a minute. Now, this ignition system is used in some form on every single internal combustion engine going down the road today. So all of our cars that we see going down the road use some sort of ignition system on that vehicle. And the components on these systems may look different from vehicle to vehicle or year to year or through the years, but their job is going to always remain the same, and that's to ignite that mixture that we have in the cylinder. And here you can see a little bit of history with an early 1900s ignition coil compared to a modern coil that you would see on an engine coming off the line today. Very different look, very different packaging, but overall the two components function in the same manner. They both help to create the ignition event inside of our cylinder. So really there's two types or two classifications of ignition systems that we see on our vehicles today. We start off with the most common being spark ignition. This is the majority of vehicles on the road today that use some form of spark ignition, and this is used on gasoline, propane, and natural gas engines. And this spark ignition uses the common components that we're used to hearing, like spark plugs, ignition coils, spark plug wires maybe a distributor or control module, those kinds of things that we've all heard of through the years. And then there's another type of ignition system, and this one kind of gets not as much attention because it's not as commonly used on vehicles today, and this would be compression ignition. So this is going to be your diesel engines, whether it's a light, medium, or heavy duty truck, or maybe a small diesel engine in some of the European cars. They all are going to use some form of compression ignition. Now these don't use the common spark ignition components. They actually use glow plugs, and the job or the goal of compression ignition is to use pressure and heat to start that compression or that combustion event inside of the cylinder instead of a spark plug and a spark in there. So they operate a little bit differently, but again, they both do the same thing. They both are on the vehicle to ignite the mixture inside of the cylinder. So now let's answer the question of what exactly spark is and why does it matter? What is it for, and what does it do, and why does it matter? Well, spark really is just one of the 4 necessary ingredients to create a combustion event. Now this combustion event is just simply the controlled burn, or sometimes called the explosion, inside of the cylinder. This is what really makes our engine run. We basically have a small explosion inside of the cylinder forcing our piston downwards, and we'll talk about those components in just a second. So we start off with our first ingredient being air. Air is mixed with fuel, and it creates this ideal air-fuel mixture because all fuel needs some sort of oxygen to burn, or most fuel needs some sort of oxygen to burn, some level of oxygen. So we bring air into the engine, and then we mix it with fuel. And fuel could be gasoline, propane, compressed natural gas, whatever it may be. And this fuel amount is going to be directly controlled and metered by the fuel injection system. So an engine that's idling, it's going to require a lot less fuel than an engine that's wide open throttle on an on-ramp. So we're going to control that fueling with the fuel injection system, and we're going to mix this air and this fuel together, and we're going to put it down into the cylinder. But really that doesn't do much for us because I could light an air-fuel mixture on the table right here, but it's not going to go bang. It's not going to create any sort of power. That power comes from compression. Compression is the squeeze that happens inside of our cylinder. It takes that air-fuel mixture and it squeezes it really, really tight, and then we ignite it. And that compression is what gives us that power inside of the cylinder. And we ignite it with, of course, spark. And spark is this heat that's created by the ignition system. Its goal is to ignite that squeezed up air-fuel mixture inside of the cylinder, and it has to happen at the correct time inside of our engine. So let's talk a little bit about this internal combustion engine. Here you can see a picture of an engine cutaway, as well as a diagram and illustration of an engine. And this is going to list out most of the components that matter to the ignition system and basically the engine running. So we'll start off with the cylinder or the combustion chamber. Think of this as a reservoir, a container that's holding that air-fuel mixture, okay? This is where we're going to put the air-fuel mixture and we're going to wait for our piston to travel upwards and squeeze that air-fuel mixture inside of that container. That piston is then tied to the crankshaft via a connecting rod. So when we squeeze that air-fuel mixture inside of that cylinder and then light it, it has that controlled burn or that explosion, and it forces that piston back downwards, which then spins our crankshaft. Our crankshaft is connected to the transmission and ultimately the wheels on our vehicle, and that's how we propel ourselves forwards or backwards or whichever way we happen to be going. Now to get that air and fuel into the engine, we have to have camshafts, and those camshafts are going to be spinning. They're tied to the crankshaft with a chain or a belt, or sometimes gears, and they're going to be spinning, and they're going to be opening and closing our valves. So we'll start with intake valves. Our intake valve on the engine is used to bring the air and fuel mixture into our cylinder. Now the intake valve is like a gateway or a doorway that blocks off the intake port. So we don't want that intake port open all the time. We only want it open when we want to bring air and fuel into our cylinder. So the valve opens and it draws that air and fuel in through the intake port. We bring it into the cylinder, we bring the piston up, we close both of the valves, and we squeeze that mixture really tight. And then we use our spark plug and ignition coil and the ignition system in general to ignite that mixture at just the right time, just that proper time, and then we force that piston back down and drive that crankshaft around. Now, after all of that happens, after we've burned up our air and fuel mixture, we need to get rid of all the used up leftovers. We have to exhaust out the engine, and that's where our exhaust valve, again, another door or gateway inside of the engine, it's going to open up the exhaust port. So we're going to empty out the cylinder, all the leftovers from the combustion event, into our exhaust system, into our catalytic converter, and eventually out the tailpipe of our engine. So these are the main components that you'll find inside of almost every single engine today. So let's break down these strokes a little bit more. Now the engine in most vehicles today is the 4-stroke engine, and for a long time that's been referred to as a very common term called suck, squeeze, bang, blow. And it really helps illustrate the different strokes on our engine and what exactly they're doing. So let's start with the first stroke being the intake stroke. This is the sucking of air and fuel down into the cylinder. So we're going to draw in that air and fuel. Our piston is traveling downwards at this point, creating this suction effect. And we're going to open up that intake valve or that intake valve gateway, whatever, and we're going to draw that mixture in, okay? Then we're going to start the squeeze, the compression stroke, our second stroke of the engine. Now our piston is traveling back upwards and we close both of those valves at the top. Now we have this sealed container with air and fuel inside of it that we're going to build pressure. We're going to squeeze it really nice and tight. Now right before the top of the travel of the piston, we're going to light off that spark plug. That spark plug is going to light and it's going to start our power stroke. Now this is the third stroke of the engine. This is that bang, this is that explosion, this is that controlled burn. This is where the air and fuel is being burned off inside of our engine. Now our piston is not just simply following along at this point, it's actually being forced downwards. And this is where our power comes from, hence power stroke. And at this point there are also no valves open on this stroke. Now we bring the piston all the way down to the bottom and we start another stroke coming up. This is our fourth stroke, the exhaust stroke, and this is the blowing out of all that spent mixture, all that exhaust, all that leftover enters into the exhaust port and goes out through our tailpipe. So we're going to have our exhaust valve open on here and our piston's going to be traveling upwards. So let's take a look at an animation here that illustrates all 4 of these strokes. Our first stroke, intake valve is open, piston's traveling down, and we're drawing or sucking in that air and fuel mixture, bringing it into the container, getting it ready to be squeezed. Now our piston's at the bottom or bottom dead center, and we bring that piston back up, and now we're on the compression stroke. We're squeezing inside of that container, inside of our cylinder, we're squeezing that air fuel really nice and tight, and then right before we get to the top of this stroke, we're going to ignite that mixture. There's that ignition event happening, and we're forcing that piston back downwards. That force is creating power on the crankshaft, and then we start our exhaust stroke, emptying all that spent mixture out of the exhaust port, out of our tailpipe eventually. So one more time, air and fuel being mixed inside of our cylinder. They're being drawn in or sucked into the cylinder. We start our compression stroke. We bring that piston back upwards, and the piston's really just kind of following along at this point. It's being driven off of other cylinders on the engine. So it's really following along. It's coming up on compression. It's squeezing, it's squeezing, it's squeezing, and then right before the top, we start that ignition event and begin our power stroke. Piston's at top dead center, and we force it back down on the power stroke. And now at the bottom, we need to exhaust, we need to get rid of all that spent mixture. We bring it up on the exhaust stroke. So that timing that spark happens at the end of the compression stroke is vital to the way this engine runs. Now it takes time to burn that mixture. It takes a little bit of time. It doesn't happen instantly. It doesn't burn it all off instantly. So again, that spark occurring and when it occurs is vital. So this ignition timing varies based on engine speed, engine design, and ignition system controller operation. So this variation is referred to as timing advance or timing retard, which basically means we're taking the timing of when that spark happens and we're either advancing it sooner or we're retarding it back to when that piston is traveling on the compression stroke. Now, you may have heard the old saying 10 degrees before TDC, where TDC simply means the piston is at the top of its travel. 10 degrees before TDC was kind of a base mark for ignition timing. We would set that spark to occur 10 degrees before the piston is at the top of its travel on the compression stroke. For many engines, again, this was base timing. But now the spark on most of our modern engines is not controlled by a set timing anymore. It's controlled by the ignition system and the ignition system controller. So many systems will vary that timing significantly depending on the engine and the conditions inside of the engine. The other thing we want to talk about here is that the spark taking this time to burn this air-fuel mixture, to burn off the entire mixture, is referred to as spark burn time or just simply burn time inside of the cylinder. And that's how long that spark is burning for and burning off that mixture inside of there on the power stroke. So now that we understand the task of the ignition system, the reason we have spark, the reason why spark happens when it does, I just wanted to briefly go over the different components that you'll find in every single ignition system. So every single ignition system shares these common components in one form or another. Every system has some sort of input, and this input is going to be a cam sensor, a pickup coil. Something is telling that spark when to fire. It could be a mechanical adjustment inside the distributor. Whatever it may be, there's some sort of input to the ignition system to label ignition spark timing. Now, there's also going to be some form of control. This could be electronic with a module of some kind or an engine controller, or this could be mechanical as well with ignition points that you'll find on old distributor style ignition systems. Then we have something that creates a large amount of power. We have our ignition coil that's going to take our small amount of charging system or battery voltage, and it's going to increase that significantly to ignition voltage. So every car has basically a step-up transformer. Then we have some sort of distribution. So this could be an old distributor, spark plug wire, ignition coil boot, whatever it may be. And then lastly, we have our spark plug, the final destination of that high voltage. This is what's creating that heat inside of the cylinder. It's got that high ignition voltage crossing the gap, creating the spark, starting our ignition event. All right, so that should do it for our basic system overview, basic ignition system, basic engine operation. Now we're going to get into this even deeper in future classes. If you had any questions about what was covered today, make sure to click on that Contact Us button there at the top. Send us out an email. We would be happy to get back to you. So thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.